So this talk is based on work that I did along with Betsy, who just spoke to you, and Sue Luder, also from Google. So about, I guess almost 5 years ago now, there was an increase in interest in postmortems at Google, and a group came together to look at how we do postmortems, what we can learn from them, how we can get more organized. And Sue was the technical program manager behind this. She did a lot of analysis of postmortems. So we're very grateful to her and to Betsy for helping us get organized in terms of sharing what we learned. So you heard a little bit about me. I'm SRE manager, tech lead for G Suite, Apps for Work in Zurich. I've always been interested in postmortems and in incident management. The two go together. You've already heard a lot about incident management during some of the tracks this week. If you're interested in getting in touch with me, it's just my name at google.com. So everyone here in the audience is likely familiar with postmortems, and the fact that at Google, you may have heard, we have sort of blameless postmortem culture. We take them very seriously. We use them to learn from the incidents we have. And you know, we've covered before in public how we do postmortem design and writing, and now we'd like to speak about how we follow up on action items. And this is sort of a continuation of a talk that was at SREcon America with Sue leading it. And I tried to focus here on items that are relevant not just to Google but to everyone here so that you can take this back and use it in your own organization. So beyond just writing a postmortem, there's also the question of what you do with it. So you write down your timeline, what went well, what went wrong. But really the key thing is the action items. The idea is capturing the things that will prevent you having the same outage again. And I think we in Google have learned a lot over the last few years on what works well for this and what doesn't. And this is something we're still learning about. So, I mean, it's not like we're perfect at this, that we always get it right. So as we go through, I'll give you some examples from my career and incidents that I've been involved with and the postmortems that we've done based on those. So the format we're going to follow is some common anti-patterns that we've seen and some best practices that we've found useful. And at some point, I will probably stop saying action items and say AIs. That's just Google jargon. So when we get towards the end of the postmortem writing process, we've gone through the timeline, what went well, what went wrong, where we got lucky. And you're starting to get into the root cause analysis stage, and then what can we change? This is where you get into the AIs. And to craft those in a thoughtful way, and to avoid them just getting lost in time forever, we have several anti-patterns that we've identified. So one of the first ones is an unbalanced AI plan. This is where you have people that are leading you in the wrong direction. So maybe some people on the team are saying, let's throw away this whole terrible system. We need to just start from scratch, complete re-architecture. And then other people are saying, well, just fix this little one thing, that will be fine. And we found that if you have only one or the other of these extremes, you end up with what we call an unbalanced AI plan, and you end up not actually mitigating the incident, because you either don't do enough or you never get to actually doing what would fix the product. So we encourage a mix of tactical and strategic items to both have quick impact on not having the same incident again, but also improving, re-architecting, making a more robust system. So one example of this that has come up in my team many times, and so we have a lot of backends. Everything at Google has a lot of backends. One backend starts serving a new error type. How does your server handle that? In the old days, it would just crash. It would just say, I've never seen this before. This is unrecognized. Give up. And then this, sometimes this won't cause problems, but this could also be a major issue and lead to a postmortem. And a number of times we just had simple tactical fix of, add the new error type. Add the new error type. Eventually, you start to see that there's a pattern here. But the extreme alternative is we need to completely redo the error code system for all of our binaries. And that is probably untenable for a relatively small team in Google to do. So we ended up with alternating between these too small and too big approaches. In the end, we were able to figure out a way of converting the error types so that we wouldn't get caught out in the future. And this was sort of a middle road. One other thing to be careful of, and I've seen this also very frequently, is overly specific action items. And these are particularly true for monitoring and testing. So when you have an outage, it's very tempting to say, add monitoring for this specific issue so we get paged before it breaks. When you add it for that specific issue, the chances of exactly that happening again are fairly low. Something very similar will happen again, but probably then your handcrafted alert is not going to help you. The same with tests. Yes, you should add a test for the exact case, but probably you should try and generalize a bit as well. Try and not just, catch the error message or whatever it might be. So avoid unbalanced or overly specific action items. So we suggest doing both, a mixture, a balance. Try not to do something that will only take months or only take hours. There should be some work that you can plan into your team's roadmap for the next weeks and months. So another anti-pattern we've seen is only fixing the symptoms rather than the root causes. What does that mean here? Well, during an outage, you see the symptoms of what happens. You see maybe server overload, or you see tasks crashing, you see 500s. It can be tempting to just tackle those. So in our example of the component interface, where we have different error code being served, it would be tempting to say, oh, well, the task shouldn't crash. And we'll put in something that detects that the task is crashing and does something clever. I don't know. But rather than that, we should look into why we're having these inconsistencies of error codes. So when it comes to actually diagnosing the issue, once you've identified what went wrong, we suggest doing root cause analysis and actually step back and say, what in our development practice or our production practice got us to this stage? Why don't we have some test that prevents this from happening? Is there any integration test that actually makes sure these different components work together? And is there something in our development methodology or process that we could change? So one potential area that we've actually been using a lot is to try and have things in the development workflow that prevent these issues from coming in at all. So we've started to use static analysis. At the time that the developer is writing code, when they're sending out their code review, we trigger a lot of analysis to see what's happening. Is there some known issue that we've seen? So one example that I've been looking into is sending RPCs that have no deadline. This is pretty much always a bad idea, but it's quite easy to do. So if you send RPCs that have no deadline, eventually somewhere in the stack they will pile up. But at the time that the developer is writing the code, often we can tell whether it's going to be sent with no deadline, or if there's a chance it could be sent with no deadline. And you can actually stop the developer right then and say, you need to change this. And this is something I'd encourage you to think about, is bring any mitigations that you can close to the developer in the development cycle. Once the code is committed, it gets harder and harder to make them change it. If you can stop them before they commit it and help them to get it right, things go better. So humans as a root cause, if you've seen the talks we've done before on postmortem culture or the article or the chapter in the SRE book, we never count humans as a root cause. And we don't want to have humans as the last why in a root cause chain. There's a couple of reasons for this. I mean, obviously, when people feel that they could be seen as the root cause, they get scared. They don't want to be seen as a risk. And this actually leads to pathological behavior, such as hiding issues or trying to avoid doing things in order to not get caught, or sweeping issues under the carpet and then not writing the postmortem because they're scared of being seen as the root cause. But there's actually another angle to it as well, that humans are inherently failure prone, that if you ask them to do something repetitively, they won't do it well. They can do it maybe a couple of times, but not as reliably as a computer. And that's good because we have computers to do reliable things frequently, not humans. So I know myself, if I want to do something more than once, maybe even more than twice, I start to get lazy and try and do it quickly, cut corners. And people will do that. Or they will just miss some trigger or something. They just can't be relied on in that way. So I'll give you an example from the first SRE team that I worked with. We used to have one of our storage backends one of the cells that we relied on would periodically have maintenance. And we had multiple cells, so that wasn't a problem. We just had to remember that there was maintenance coming up, and we would route our traffic away from that cell before they started the maintenance. Sounds reasonable. I'm sure many people do that. That was fine when it was once a quarter. Then it started to become more like once a week. And there was, each on-call engineer had to remember, oh, on Thursday, such and such a thing is happening. This got more and more frequent, and the number of times that it slipped increased. And then we started to have not only the sort of periodic maintenance events, but also emergency maintenance events. And each time someone forgot to move the traffic, we would have a small outage, and then a slightly bigger one. And eventually, we had one very large incident. And we realized that this was actually not a good system that we had. When we sat down and looked at what the root cause was here and started to think about action items, we thought that really we should get humans out of this. And it turned out that we could completely remove this whole step. So rather than just trying to improve how the humans worked by giving them reminders, like a calendar reminder or emails or an update in the corner of their screen, like don't forget, you need to, we just changed our config so that it would automatically move the traffic when the backend went away. And that was 6 years ago, and we never had the issue again. We had the issue a lot of times before that, and as I said, we're still not perfect at this kind of analysis work. So do look at why the human is involved and see if you can completely take the human out of the process. Computers talking to computers are much better than having a human in the middle. So lacking visibility into the production stack is bad, but having a human needing to be in the middle of things is really a red flag that you should be trying to move away from. So another anti-pattern that we've seen is not going beyond prevention when thinking about action items. So we classify our action items into different categories. There's mitigation, prevention, detection, and a lot of times people aim for prevention. So prevention is making sure this incident or class of incident will never happen again. And that, of course, is like the gold standard. Ideally, it never happens again. And it's tempting to design your action item plan only around those like actions that will prevent recurrence. But typically, those are far more expensive and time-consuming than mitigation or detection. So mitigation in this case means shortening an incident or making the incident affect a smaller number of customers, users, systems. And that can often be cheaper than preventing it entirely. Like, you might have to change your entire database layer in order to prevent it entirely, but maybe you could have a phased rollout of 1%, 5%, 20% that helps you to only affect a smaller number of customers if something does go wrong. And that can be very cheap in comparison. And also in terms of detection, when we look at the overall duration of our incidents, detection is a large section of the incident. By the time we actually detect it, if we detected it earlier, we could have actually shortened the incident. Obviously, if we prevented it entirely, that would be ideal, but there's always a cost-benefit trade-off to these things. And I would definitely focus on, I would say if I could tell you one thing from all of the postmortems that I've written, and red, scaling back your initial rollout from 100% to anything else is the single biggest thing you can improve. That means that you're mitigating the impact of anything that goes wrong. So if you can shorten the detection or improve the mitigation steps, the overall incident gets smaller, either in scope or in length. And that also makes life a lot easier for your SREs. So now we've talked about some of the anti-patterns that we've seen at Google. We also have some best practices that we've seen, not so much in constructing the action item plan, but in how we follow through to make those actually get done. So the first one is to prioritize and classify the work. So we ask our postmortem authors to classify the action items by type so that we can make sure that we have, like I mentioned, detection, mitigation, prevention. We also ask them to prioritize the action items. So the priority guides how much, or what the SLO is for actually closing them out. So that could be between like P0, P1, P2, P3. And P0 we use for a high risk of unmitigated recurrence. So this means if we do not fix this root cause issue, there's a good chance that we're going to have this whole incident again. And you could have the incident again, but it could be bigger next time. That's always worth remembering. And one thing that has changed at Google is that we now require, each incident to have at least one P0 or P1 action item. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Another best practice is executive focus. If senior leaders are actually paying close attention to postmortems and to action items, then they're far more likely to get closed out. So at Google, postmortems are on the radar for the cloud org, for the SRE org, and for, in my own case, the apps org. We review postmortems. The VPs and directors review the high-level postmortems to make sure that they're actually getting addressed. And SRE leadership requires that every postmortem that affects users has a P0 or P1 bug. One other tip that I can give is to get a sponsor inside your organization, someone, mid-level or high-level management that says, I want to mitigate our business risk. I want to make sure we're doing a good job of postmortems, and just have them involved when you do postmortem reviews, have them congratulate people for doing them, send out an update every quarter. We've done such and such a postmortem, we've learned this. Having them involved can make your job in rolling out a postmortem culture process a lot easier. So this is from Ben Traynor, who is the founder of SRE in Google, the VP of SRE. To our users, a postmortem without subsequent action is indistinguishable from no postmortem. If we don't do anything with it, then it was pretty pointless writing it. And we have this, at least one P0 or P1 bug associated with them. This has to be related to the root cause of the incident. So you have to have some action item that will actually prevent the incident from recurring. So I mentioned that we're still learning in Google and myself in terms of how we do postmortems and action items. And it was actually one of my previous teams that led to this policy of P0 and P1 bugs. So we had a medium-sized incident, and we wrote up a good postmortem, did a lot of analysis, wrote up pretty decent action items, and they were a mix of nice-to-have things and root cause fixes. We never prioritized them in any way. We just sort of filed them and mostly forgot about them. We fixed a few of the easy ones. And then we had the same incident again, I would say 10 times as large, with the same root causes, the same bugs associated. And at that point, we were talking with Sue, talking with other leads. We realized that this is not working. If you have no prioritization associated, then you don't know what the difference is between a nice-to-have and the real root cause fix. And that's when we got into having these P0, P1 bugs and saying these are the ones that need to be closed out for this incident, for this postmortem to be called complete. We also have, in some teams, postmortem reviews. In the cloud team, they have it all the way up to the VP level, and reports. So you can have a postmortem review for an individual postmortem, or you can have reviews across an org to say what is going on, how are we doing on the postmortem action items. Typically the format here is to walk through the incident, the timeline, the impact, the root cause, make sure that all the open comment threads or discussions are closed out, review the lessons learned, what went well, what went wrong, where we got lucky, and make sure those are covering what we saw during the incident. And what we usually find is that those lessons learned directly feed into the action items. For every entry in the lessons learned, there should probably be an action item. And that's when I'm walking people through the process. I don't have them add action items initially. We just talk about what went well and what went wrong. And then once we have that more or less complete, those feed into the action items. So these reviews should happen soon after an incident, because the longer you leave it, the less people remember. So try not to let things linger. In my team, we have a target of 24 business hours to have a draft postmortem ready. And sometimes it's not what you want to do immediately after the incident, but we realize that it makes sense. And it's better to get people together and put the postmortem together at that time rather than letting it drag on. So we've also, and particularly Sue in this case, have built reports and dashboards around the action items that are coming out of our postmortems. And these are across all of the postmortems in Google. So we have a system that aggregates them and analyzes the thousands of postmortems. And from these we've learned quite a lot of things. You can remember back to the P0 and P1 that I mentioned, these critical and high priority issues. They're getting closed out. When you get down to the low and trivial, these nice to haves, they sometimes get closed out, but on a slower rate. And I think the other thing that we've seen is that the age, both the response time and the resolution time for these bugs are important. You want to make sure that you're not letting them get stale, but that you're also closing them out completely. So we have an SLO for bugs at different priority levels that are associated with a postmortem. And the other thing I would say is, once a bug is no longer relevant, or if it might not be relevant, you're better to just close it out and say, we're not going to work on this, rather than adding to an ever-increasing pile of technical debt. So this is a graph of total number of bugs created versus closed. And that gap that you see there is a little risk in terms of the amount of debt that is increasing. So as these bugs increase, you start to lose track of which ones are still important, which ones you actually want to fix. So triage processes where you go back and just say, not relevant, we deleted that whole subsystem, we're never going to fix this bug. That's better than just keeping them hanging around. So we've mentioned some sort of stick approaches of getting people to close out bugs or to do a good job. There can also be carrots associated with this as well. So in SRE we have a fix-it every quarter where we go through and review bugs, and people get prizes for whoever does the most bug triage, bug closing. And we also, in Google, in the promotion process, take into account writing postmortems, closing out high priority action items. People feel proud of, there's a risk if you have a big incident that people feel scared or sad about it. Typically, if there's a big incident and you write a good postmortem, you can feel proud of that. People will congratulate you. I know that I will send it out to all of our engineers in G Suite saying, this person did a great job. Writing up the postmortem, following up on the action items, getting other teams on board to fix things. That's the kind of behavior that we want to reward. So we've covered a lot of different anti-patterns and best practices here, but in summary, your postmortem should feature a balanced action item plan, so small and big items, mitigation, prevention, detection, and then also have concrete follow-up steps. So how do you actually make sure that those happen? So your company may be conducting or starting to conduct postmortems. Once you are conducting the postmortems, then we hope that these tips will be useful to you and save you some of the pain that we've experienced over the years in learning about them. And one caveat that I would add is Google is a bit specific in some ways. We have, it's a very large organization. You can modify these recommendations for a smaller organization. We're very focused in hosted services. We're pretty intolerant to downtime for almost all our services at this point. You can also modify to say which systems you're most concerned about, where you want to start. Don't try and go too big too early. If you try and fix everything, you may not make any progress. And also bear in mind how tolerant your teams will be of rigorous processes. Maybe you don't want to end up with a revolution on your hands when you try and start chasing bugs all at the same time. So there's some further resources. There's an expanded version of this talk in the USENIX login article from earlier this year. There's the postmortem culture chapter from Sue and I in the SRE book. And I've also got some sample checklists up here for postmortem action items, if you want to come up and get one at the end of the talk. Thank you.